The first thing that struck me when I looked at the literature on consciousness is that there just wasn't a visual model that was useful in helping you to step into it. There were only, for instance, Freudian or Adlerian or Jungian constructs to begin the process of trying to map out what are we talking about when we talk about consciousness. All the key traumas of the past are manifesting now in your present time and space. Okay, it's just you can't connect them back to their originating cause that easily.
Right.
They seem as though they're springing out of your present circumstances, and they're not. Your present circumstances are infinitely malleable.
Hello and welcome to the Spirit Box podcast, where we explore folklore, magic, the world of the spirits, and everything in between. For episode 87, we are joined by the great Peter Mark Adams, discussing his new book, The Power of the Healing Field. Now, it's a fantastic title and one I really enjoyed reading. And it goes into sharing some of the remarkable cases of healing and personal transformation from Peter and his wife's more than 20 years of intensive professional energy healing work, as well as the experiences from other gifted healers, psychics, and shamans. Peter illustrates the role of transpersonal fields of consciousness in healing a range of issues, from inherited family and ancestral problems to past lives and womb trauma, to near-death experience, merged identities, and spirit attachment. Drawing on esoteric tradition as well as scientific research, such as Rupert Sheldrake's morphic field studies, Peter maps out the human energy field in all its subtleties, providing diagrams of the human energy body and the spectrum of states of awareness, the multilayered field of consciousness, and the psychoenergetic dynamics of the transformation process. Now, if you're anything like me and you find learning visually is the best way to get information and ideas in, these diagrams are really useful and they're really well put together. Now, also, too, there's lots of testimonies here about some really powerful healings, and Peter demonstrates how the process of healing and peak spiritual experiences are closely aligned with harmony within the energetic field of consciousness. And we get into that in some depth, that it is an ethical energy field. It's really interesting, and it's pretty moving actually when you really think about that model. In the book, Peter also talks about different energy healing modalities. Obviously, Reiki is at the forefront of that, but also breathwork, EFT, and rebirthing. I think one of the really interesting things for me with this book is that you can literally close it and start doing some of the healing work, which is phenomenal. Now, in the Plus show, we get into rebirthing in a bit more detail. We talk chthonic visions and dreams and entities in a bit more depth. We talk more about family timelines, discuss the spancel of death story, and spiritual emergencies, particularly the negative effects of Kundalini surges and the difficulties that can arise from trying to manage that level of energy. And then we get a little bit more into the ethics element, and Peter really lands this beautiful idea of we heal one person, then we heal all, and that our responsibility there is to heal ourselves so that we can heal all. Which I think is a lovely idea and a really important piece of individual sovereignty. We have that responsibility to make sure we look after ourselves. And I mean that in the gentlest, kindest way. Now, if you would like to be gentle and kind to me and the Spirit Box podcast, you can do so by joining the Patreon, or indeed giving the show the old 5 stars. You know the drill. You know how this all works. Patreon gives you access to the Plus show, which is further in-depth conversations with fantastic people like Peter. Now, I'm going to stop talking and we can get into it, and let's hear from Peter Mark Adams. Peter Mark Adams, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you back to the Spirit Box. Lovely to see you again, sir.
Hello there. It's a pleasure to be back.
Fantastic. Well, you've just launched your new book, The Power of the Healing Field. We discussed it a little bit in the last time you were on before Christmas. But now it's out there, and there's lots of interest. And I revisited it again in preparation for this show. There's a number of areas that are really stand out, and we'll get to that as we progress through the show. But I kind of wanted to ask you to kick things off. What's the executive summary, given our last conversation, of the book for those listening?
Okay, essentially, from my perspective, it's the fact that what we think of as our biographical history has enormous extensions on it back into time. And most of our confusion in life is the fact that we cannot assimilate data from past lives, from the perinatal period in the womb, from our birth process, even childhood. I mean, a lot of people's memories kick in quite late into their current lifespan. So there's a kind of vast baggage being towed into this life. And it's from that baggage that we find that most of the problems people encounter emerge. So the attempt in this book is to cast light on this, to present this extended biographical timeline and say, okay, if you're looking at reality, you need to look at it with this perspective in mind. It's not enough just to look at your immediate surroundings, your relationship with, say, your boss or your spouse, or with money and power. These are certainly very important clues, but the roots are deep and may lie in several lives previously. So I wanted to give concrete cases where this was found to be the case, and that the crux of the healing issue lay far outside the person's biographical memory. Okay, so when we change the framing, all of a sudden the capacity that we have to engineer fundamental change in our lives is greatly enhanced. Okay, that's really what I wanted to get across with the book, and to show that change was literally to hand. There are now techniques available which are so powerful, so effective, and yet so easy to administer or even self-administer, that really there should not be anything stopping anybody with an ambition for a better sense of themselves to begin work. I hope the book captures something of that spirit.
I think it does. I really do. And like, because the arguments are very well structured. The examples, again, are very well chosen and used to illustrate points quite clearly, without kind of obfuscating anything. It's just kind of you're presenting them the cases as you see it, but also putting behind it a robust structure. And
I think the structure had two aspects to it. One is this kind of extended timeline, and the other is a kind of reminder, so to speak, on the enormous variety of states of awareness that are accessible to us. You know, if we're very much plugged into our day-to-day routines, we tend to inhabit a very narrow band of awareness day to day. And we forget just how wide, how broad, and how generative the capacity to move our awareness into different states is. And that is also a fundamental building block of the book's argument. We are far more expansive as individuals than our daily awareness even gives a hint of.
And you illustrate that beautifully, that kind of that expansive map that we all have access to, you know, with the the right training and work. But the spectrum of consciousness, which I find a really useful tool. Not necessarily kind of to quote the famous kind of metaphysical view on maps, so the idea that kind of the map is not the territory, but it does show the complexity. It shows roughly how these things sit together, and to kind of build that out into structure. When you were structuring the book, is that something that you had in mind? Was it to?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. When I started this book, it was a long time ago, back in 2010.
Right.
And the first thing that struck me when I looked at the literature on consciousness is that there just wasn't a visual model that was useful in helping you to step into it. Mm-hmm. There were only, for instance, Freudian or Adlerian or Jungian constructs to begin the process of trying to map out what are we talking about when we talk about consciousness. The rest of the stuff was either neuroscience or it was philosophy.
Yeah.
And equally dense in both directions.
Yeah.
So my first job was to say, okay, what have we actually got here? And try and pull in all the sources that I had access to from shamanism, from mystical spiritual experiences, psi, and even the normal range of consciousness, the different dream states, for instance. And as I started to assemble all of this, I found that it actually fell together in a fairly well-structured way. So I thought, okay, this is never going to be a complete model.
Yeah.
But as an aid memoir, it's a damn good place to start.
Yeah, it really is.
In just looking at the range, the dynamic range of our awareness, and to be reminded of that. Okay.
Yeah, I know. I found it very, very useful, and kind of one of the areas that I found very illuminating, and kind of when I started out, was I found the kind of the depth in Islam working through a spirit intrusion. Now again, it's very siloed in the sense of it's like anything beyond is evil, right? Much as Christianity is, but it's still a living tradition. And what it made me think of is that within the West, we don't have, and I used to use the word technology to describe it, which I think is doesn't suit anymore, but we don't have the technology to understand what we're dealing with in that side of things, where there's spirit intrusion. And I felt that the consciousness map and the elements that you lay out here, you start to kind of lay out the range of subject, the range of kind of areas of study and expertise that start to kind of shine light into those areas that we've lost in the West.
Yeah, that was essentially the purpose of the book, and also to show how you could intervene in that much broader map of things. So for me, that was a big part of it, to actually come up with cases that illustrated healing, successful healing in those various dimensions, and show how it was done, how the techniques were used, and the kind of positive effect that the good outcomes had subsequently on the people's lives. So it was like moving the furniture in their basement. Very often they had no awareness of the depths to which their day-to-day problems, had their roots deep down in like the fact that they had died as a child in a previous life and then be reborn within the same family, like carrying a guilt and a sense of responsibility for the dead child's death in this life, despite having no knowledge of that as part of family history. So this kind of thing was amazing to me. And it just said, our ignorance in terms of this broader, stretched out biographical timeline has terrible consequences, because people are continuously looking for orthodox treatment for things which are deeply psychic wounds in other lives. And of course, the paradigm will not contain that in the West. Still will not.
Yeah. I think that's the most succinct articulation of the scale of the problem that kind of
Yeah.
I've had in this show. It's because it's, the pathologizing of issues of like of origin that you have, as you just described, ends up being treated as mental health issues.
Yeah.
And
Or they people going for back surgery.
yeah.
That is, it's unbelievable to me. I mean,
Mm.
1-2 rounds of like tapping, meridian tapping,
Mm.
and most back pain is immediately and permanently dissolved,
Yeah.
and yet we still see people going off and having back surgery, for God's
Yeah.
sakes,
Yeah.
as though that is the cause. So there's an awful lot of this going on.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. No, it's again, and that's why I just think that it's very timely. This work. I love how you've also frame like some of the immediately accessible techniques, like tapping and what have you. Because that's just like, it's not, you don't have to meditate for 20 years under a waterfall to get to this.
no.
You can just crack on.
That's it. That's
Yeah,
it.
and it is part of our birthright to be able to
Yeah,
heal ourselves in this
absolutely.
way.
And the terrible thing is that they've been around for 30 odd years,
Yeah.
you know. And when you just look at PTSD, for instance, Gary Craig's work on that in the early 80s, developing thought field therapy into emotional freedom techniques, which was his big contribution, and then showing that you could knock PTSD down in 2 or 3 sessions.
Wow.
Okay, it wasn't gone, but it was a minor anxiety now.
Mm-hmm.
And here we are 30 years later, and how many thousand people who've been through severe trauma, are dying because of suicide each year.
Yeah. Yeah.
So anyway, it's an attempt to move the narrative into a far more empowering place than it has been up to now. That was a huge motivation, really.
Yeah.
This can be done now.
I think it does feel to me that it, like I said, timely. I think we're in this weird time at the moment. I had a message from kind of a friend today, just articulating how strange and how out of place he found everything, and everything was just weird, and kind of like the artifices of reality that kind of, whether we subscribe to them or not, they anchored us. That seems to be in a process of weakening.
I think for me, it also highlighted another thing. That's to say, the vulnerability that we all experienced all of a sudden. It's kind, it like came out of the blue. It kicked off, and it became so extreme in terms of its psychological consequences, the isolation, the fear. And although that's eased off now, what it highlighted for me is the need for us all to be far more aware about how we can strengthen our own immune systems. And that these techniques, this emotional clearing, is an integral part of strengthening your immune system. So timely in that sense.
What the other bit to me, and I think the spectrum of consciousness map articulated quite well as for me as well is the idea of also place. So where we are, in terms of how we're interacting with the space around us, and that, like, while we have those ancestral relationships that affect us in ways that we don't really understand or can be perplexing, equally places is doing the same thing. But this is where, when we look at kind of the challenges we've had over the last 2 years, one of the big ones we have is our supply chains, access to food, and all that kind of stuff. The access to food is generally access to bad food, poor quality food, and you touch on this in the book, and towards the end of it, and you talk about values, which I know we mentioned it before we started, which I thought was superb.
really, really superb. And I would recommend anybody purchase the book. If not for anything, just read that last section. Read the whole book, but if you've only got 5 minutes, read the last section. From my perspective, Peter, you'd be like, shut up, just read the book. But I that's how much it stayed with me. I thought it was a wonderful piece. But it's like these things are falling away, and we're starting to see some of our kind of realities and the complexities of them. Going back to the kind of the earlier point of beyond time, the healing issues beyond time, and you talk about, you mentioned kind of merging identities of like a child dying in the same family line, and the kind of the impact of guilt on that. You also talked about family work, and when you give a remarkable case around the family work and past lives. So the impact of kind of ancestors, but also kind of unresolved family issues, lasting beyond death, and how that can have impact. That seems to be coming up again and again for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, once you accept this kind of long timeline, this bigger game being in play, you need to recognize that all the key traumas of the past are manifesting now in your present time and space. Okay, it's just you can't connect them back to their originating cause that easily.
Right.
They seem as though they're springing out of your present circumstances, and they're not. Mm-hmm. Your present circumstances are infinitely malleable. So that typically when people do trace back and solve a major trauma in a deep past timeline, their circumstances in the present begin to change very rapidly and positively. Mm-hmm. So that's our relationship day to day with money, power, spouses, children. We've seen this again and again. It's almost as though you've like thrown a switch which relates to some life previously, and all of a sudden your present circumstances adjust as though that's not an element anymore. Okay, right. So everything that you have carrying through this timeline is in some form manifesting itself in the here and now. Mm-hmm. It's not buried. It's just not connected with its originating course in our awareness. Actually, it's profoundly connected. Our awareness cannot grasp the connection. We lose our sense of the deep memory whenever we incarnate. Right. And so it's as though everything starts afresh again. Of course, it's not fresh again. Mm-hmm. It's the same old thing again. William Faulkner said that the past is never dead. It's not even past.
Yeah. In terms of the modalities to deal with some of those issues, and I know some of them are complex. And you kind of outlined a case where there's multiple actors involved to kind of talk through a scenario. Yeah. But much like kind of emotional freedom technique and tapping, how can I as an individual access, say, family line healing if I don't have access to someone with the knowledge and skills of yourself?
You'll find that, in fact, family constellation healing is pretty well universal today. Certainly in the UK, you wouldn't have a problem going along as an observing participant, not looking for therapy. Yeah. What I'm suggesting is people go along there as an observing participant, and you may or may not be selected to represent somebody's father, whatever. But by going along for 2 or 3 sessions, you begin to see how it works. Right. And you can decide then for yourself whether you're going to benefit from actually going as somebody wanting the therapy done on them. Right. Okay. So I just suggest with all these techniques that you acquaint yourself with them initially, see whether they're for you. Not all techniques are. But the family constellation one is one of the more profound, I would say. A lot depends on who is guiding it. There's various levels of, let's say, formality. So the people who are from the Bert Hellinger school, which is the kind of founding school for that, will have a fairly disciplined approach to it. The person I went to was far more, well, they had Jungian training, but they were far more into shamanism. Mm-hmm. And they had a much higher kind of intensity about the whole process. So, you know, at the end of the day, I was like headachy. You know, the energy in the group was so strong when they, you know, you select the people who you want to represent, your father, mother, whatever, brother, sister. They place them in the middle of the room as though they're in relationship to each other to kind of reflect your sense of their relationships. And then you sit down. That's the extraordinary thing. You don't give an account of the family history. No, you just sit down and watch. The therapist goes around them. And from my personal experience, I can say as soon as that formation is established in the middle of the room, you have an emotional overlay. That's to say you're fully aware of yourself, your feelings, thoughts, but you have all of a sudden access to somebody else's thoughts, feelings, emotions, and even their physical posture. So the therapist then comes around and checks on that alter.
Right.
And by readjusting the relationships between them, and they're always ethical. This is the important thing. By symbolically recreating the field of a family's relationships, you surface the ethical problems within it. Mm-hmm. You can then address the ethical issue. That's to say, you can seek forgiveness and grant forgiveness. And when that is done, the field changes. The tension goes out of it. And effectively, what you're doing then is the symbolic formation gives rise to an energy field. The energy field allows the participants to access the broader, non-local, atemporal field of consciousness. And because it's an intentional, intended process, it always brings the healing crux to the fore. And then, this is the mechanism. It's extraordinary, but this is how it works. Once the healing crux is brought to the front, the ethical dilemma is resolved and the field is recoded, and it ripples out through the entire family. Okay, so this is the kind of extraordinary experience that I'm urging people, go along, find out for yourself, get into it, just attend a couple of sessions as a participating observer and see if it's for you. But this is for me the way to go about unraveling, especially long-term ancestral healing. Although my partner is very, very good at this in a one-on-one context, not all the healers are.
Yeah.
You know, you need to have a very finely tuned antenna, let's say, for this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But with the family constellation therapy, it's up front, you know, it's addressed immediately. And if there's people who are involved in this ethical dilemma who are not present, they're not represented, they're long dead, for instance, the field will indicate their absence. And people can then be brought on to represent that person, even if it's 4 or 5, 6 generations back. It doesn't matter.
That's remarkable.
The field is a complete capture of the ethical nature of behavior within a extended family timeline. Mm-hmm. And so it also gives us a massive insight into what I would call the reality of panpsychism. Okay, so you're working now from the experience towards the theory rather than from the theory saying, well, where's the evidence for panpsychism? Yeah. Look, it's here. It's right in front of you. You only need to go and work with it to find the truth of it for yourself.
Mm-hmm. Remarkable. It's such a challenging area to wrap your head around, that how that emotional overlay can happen, you know. And I guess the impetus or the instinctive impetus to do that, to try and rationalize it, is where we end up tripping ourselves up.
I mean, we've all got this mind-body dualism in our educational background and in our cultural conditioning, and it's basically false. It's just wrong, but it's still there. So we all have this questioning skeptic whenever we're confronted with the deeper operations of reality. Our questioning skeptic steps in and says, oh, well, even if I accept it, I'm not going to admit it because everyone else will think I'm superstitious. And so, there's like a conspiracy of silence around it. And, I hope this book is going to start puncturing that conspiracy of silence. It will no longer be seen as kind of threatening to your status to admit, yes, panpsychism, I agree with that. And it has fundamental implications in just about every dimension of life.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. And to pull that thread a little bit, I mean, the language you use describing the field in terms of like the field has an ethical interface.
The field is an ethical field. Fundamentally.
Because I've always struggled with the idea of like karma in the way it's kind of portrayed. I was like, well, no, I don't see how that works. But for me, the idea of an ethical field that denotes how you interact with it and how it'll interact with you on the basis of this that ethical standard, I think is really intriguing, and it makes sense. And there's also sorry, go on.
Okay, so if we pull that thread a little, what do we mean when we say something is ethical? What is the essence of ethical? We know that ethics has three major dimensions, which is, say, there's an ethics of autonomy, the respect for the individual. There's a ethics of community, which is a respect for our interaction and how that is managed. And then there's an ethics of divinity, which is the inherent sense of spirituality that we carry. Right. So these three areas of ethics are recognized universally. I point you towards Richard Schweder's work on this, the comparative ethnography of these ethical systems. Well, what these ethical systems are all saying is that at its very heart, the universe is love. And there's a beautiful saying of sorry, I can't remember. He said that the arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
Which it kind of encapsulates one aspect of it. But beneath justice is this fair treatment. And that comes from empathic understanding. And empathy is based on fundamental property of love. Which is the driving force.
That's just wonderful. See, you say these things to me, Peter, and then you take me into these deep, meaningful conversations, and then I have to keep the conversation going as a podcast. And I need time.
You should tell some jokes at this point, then, shouldn't you? Any good jokes, should I?
Yeah.
Break the
as I try and formulate my thoughts. One of the areas that one of the areas I was thinking about in as you were discussing your point there is how fairies have dictated behavior to people, like the way that, in a quite strict way, but would stay with me, bear with me on this one. They do not like avarice. They loathe lying, and it's like at a base level, it just reminded me that kind of like that part of our behavior and how we're able to interact with certain spirits has an ethical element to it as well. There's a set of behaviors that are expected before you can engage.
Yeah, I think the popular culture has grasped this.
Yeah.
And certainly cultures outside of the Western materialist paradigm have never lost it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we have these oddities like, Kipling's writings about animals, and their inherent ethical nature. It was like, where did that come from? Well,
yeah,
crossing over into other cultures, that's where it comes from. So it shows that in a sense we've enormously impoverished Western culture through our focus on basically technological advancement,
Yeah.
But I think we're also at a watershed now. I think we're at a watershed of some enormous change, and that it's manifesting itself finally amongst the kind of intellectual elite. So that, for instance, panpsychism is now a major topic of discussion amongst philosophers at an international level. That would have been almost unthinkable 10, 15 years ago. But, it's right there now. You also find neuroscientists, you have Rupert Sheldrake, the morphic field. What is that except the field of consciousness? And of course, he's identified that other factor. Morphic resonance is the way in which the field generates effects downwards. So actually his entire biologically based model parallels in every way what I've been saying.
Yeah.
It's exactly how the constellation therapy works.
It's extraordinary.
Yeah. So as I say, I think we're on the brink of a major change in worldview in the West. I think there's a lot of factors bringing it about.
Yeah.
But it feels like a tipping point is being reached.
I agree completely. Yeah.
So we just need to keep pushing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. We definitely are standing at the edge of something, and I think a lot of people, again, empathically, or can see that there's one direction we could go, which is probably not going to be very pleasant for us. It'll be the easiest one for us to take, but it's not going to work out that well in the end. And I think it's got a lot to do with personal sovereignty, and accepting an ownership of one's sovereignty. And I see that as being sovereignty with responsibility, again, which you kind of but I'm paraphrasing.
That's the ethics of community, isn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly it. And it's our responsibility to one another in a horizontal communal way, our responsibility to our environment and all the animals and life that lives within our direct environment. And
that's just adjacent to the ethics of divinity, isn't it?
It's exactly
it. Spiritual, woven into everything. So I'm very positive from that point of view that we're moving in a good direction societally.
Yeah.
Even though there's a lot of
challenges,
stuff wrong still. It's not perfect.
But more and more people are saying the same thing. They're articulating it from their perspective. It's like, for example, I know we touched on it before the show started, around, a lot more people are actually seeing the ill effects of social media rather than the benefits, because it's an artificial structure. It doesn't represent a community. It has some of the behaviors, but it's not the same as a community, where you have the commonalities of place, tactile things that aren't there. There's replicants of it, and some areas about it, and I don't want to kind of poo-poo everything, but it's understanding that there is a difference to relationships that are based in kind of the physical world and physical spaces, that are also kind of, as we've already alluded to, they're beyond the physical. There's those pieces that are there, and I don't believe digital communities can fully replicate a lot of that. Even though we can talk about non-localism and all that kind of stuff, through morphogenic fields and what have you, there's something about those spaces that they take on a mindset of their own that tends to dominate things, and that's something that I've noticed.
talking of mind spaces, it was interesting in the Sunday Times. I noticed a editorial to the effect of why are we still following shareholder value as the only success factor for major corporations, you know, referring back to Milton Friedman's original essay, I think 1972 or something. And you know, the fact that a major newspaper is like just coming out and saying, well, you know, this is just wrong. There's, you know, we have to look at the environmental considerations. We have to look at so many considerations and move to this stakeholder value. People have been talking about it for years, but we're still not actually acting in that way. And so that was interesting to me, that, you know, an issue like that is now being brought forward in such a conservative medium, for instance.
That is a significant step change. You know, I mean, that is a media vehicle that has, you know, shareholders.
If the shareholders, they'll be reading.
You know, and I think that the shareholder point and the kind of the only indicator of progress and value being monetary is a significant problem. And I think, to be honest, what I kind of just described earlier in terms of why I don't think the digital communities can be as valuable as human ones, I think fundamentally because the vehicle you're exchanging in has that different areas of value. So it's like your value is engagement, or whatever the algorithm denotes as being important. Everything has to go through that filter, and I think that devalues the original message. So it's a similar thing. You know, it's like the point of value is data that can be monetized, like rather than something more cosmic.
And another indicator, I think, is the tendency now, for instance, to acknowledge the personhood of natural features. This is incredible, you know, like rivers and things like this. And most of us who've, I say, grown up in this Western materialist education system have to take like a double take when we hear
100%. 100%.
You know, and like, okay, we have to step back and then think about it again and come at it. Oh, right, now I got it. You know, but the immediate impact of it is like a what? You know, where you know the materialism is so ingrained even in the best intentioned individuals. But when we're faced with this out and out animism, like, you know, we have this like double take, and then like we catch up if we're lucky.
No, you're right. I mean, it is. There are some currents and ideas that are just world changing, that are really surfacing in a most positive way. Well, and it's, you know, it's lovely to have this conversation because it is, you know, the world at the moment, the last couple of years has been coming to that, skidding to a halt at the cliff edge, and we're all living in that lack of, you know, assurance now that we're, as Westerners, we're particularly not used to, right? You know, we've been living kind of lives from cradle to grave with a fairly kind of set path. That's kind of eroding massively. You know,
well, it was so refreshing for me, Dara. I just read Gordon White's Animistic.
Oh, cool.
You know, and it's fabulous stories in there, which really bring this animist perspective into a very clear light. So, you know, I heavily recommend that. Wonderful, but very timely as well. Very timely.
I agree completely. My copy is literally in the post. I just got my email from Scarlet Imprint today. yeah, totally. Just before we got the call.
All week to try and get them posted out this week. But it's a delightful read and beautifully written. So it's
fantastic. I look forward to that. Absolutely. Right, onto a less friendly and joyous subject matter. So in the middle of the book, you talk about spirit attachment. You know, and as I said before, this is kind of an area that kind of when I brushed up against it as a as a subject matter of spirits that can have a negative motivation and interest in individuals and why they would have those interests. It's always been an area of, I guess, morbid fascination to a degree. But I think part of the drive behind it is somewhere along the line, I, again, empathically believed this was true. This was the case. And you can't really defend yourself against something if you don't understand it or accept it. So could you talk to the how you've defined it as the GUI, an etheric astral complex? Now, I know that's one aspect of spirit attachment that you've talked to, but I think it's quite an interesting one. And again, you've illustrated it beautifully in the book in terms of the model you present. But could you talk to that?
Oh, right. Yeah. I mean, I think the most common circumstance in healing work where we come across this is people have a persistent ache or pain and there's no medical reason for it. And, very often it's happened after they've had, for instance, surgery. They've been under anesthetic. They come out of hospital. Pardon me. And for some reason, it just doesn't seem to be right anymore. And what we found is that doing the energy healing, they've had an attachment by someone who has died at the point in the hospital, at the point at which they were under anesthetic, and in kind of not understanding or accepting death, they've like attached themselves to that person's energy body, and kind of living. I wouldn't call it an existence, but it's a kind of continuity, and possibly in their own imaginary space, they think they're still alive.
Right. So
this kind of bizarre situation certainly occurs. I wouldn't say frequently, but it'll come up if your career is energy healing. It'll come up at some point. And all you need to do in that case is you can either talk to them directly and convince them to go on, because most of the haunting type phenomena, and this is a kind of haunting, let's face it,
right,
is not understanding that they're dead, being too attached to a place. The emotional attachment is too strong. So there's a space in which you can reason with that, and you can heal the person and release the spirit to go on, because actually there's no choice about it. Actually, once death comes, you need to embrace death, and that's another big problem in our culture, because of our grossly restricted sense of our timeline, our biographical timeline, our inability to see the bigger game. Death has become this all or nothing, thing, and it isn't.
Yeah,
it's a transition at a certain point in our life in order to make fundamental changes and reevaluate and come back and have another go, basically. So, reframing the death experience is an important, benefit, I would say, from reading things like this book or any of the psychics. I listened to Matt Fraser, he's an incredible psychic. There's always people like this who have a natural and immediate ability to converse with the dead.
Yeah.
And most of the time, those conversations are extremely positive. The way we frame this is problematic, because we're seeing them as dead, and yet we're saying also reincarnation exists. And those two propositions don't sit together in the same space. Okay. So whatever you do, you're going to be in conflict with yourself. Okay. They can't both be true logically, but they are.
Yeah.
So that means our sense of time and space is too minimal to grasp the fullness of the reality we inhabit. Okay, that's the problem.
Yeah.
We've got a tiny purchase on reality. You know, a lot of people say, well, where are all these energies and these, well, Our entire physics is located on 5% of the visible universe. The other 95% is utterly unknown to us. We don't even know where to begin with it. So don't say there isn't space for it.
Yeah.
And I bring this up because I photographed the Reiki energy manifesting itself. And I did that with one of the first digital cameras that has almost no processing on it whatsoever. And I took the photograph of the Reiki graduation group with a flash. And it's as though I stood in front of the mirror and let the camera off, looking through the viewfinder at the mirror, and the light just flashed straight back into my eyes. And yet there was nothing visible in the room at the time. So I just took it again 2 seconds later, and it did it again, and a third time and a fourth time.
Yeah.
And it was clear. So that was energy in some form, which was not visible to our senses, but nevertheless, which interacted with the light energy, with the intense light energy of the flash.
Yeah.
And that's a bizarre thing.
Yeah. They're remarkable images.
So, we've got this problem with the dimensions of space-time around us. So it is true that people reincarnate. We have hard evidence of that through the healing process. It is also true that people who have died visit and give advice, explain themselves, and how you reconcile those two. Good luck.
Oh, I mean, it gets even worse. I mean, there's dozens of cases of the dead identifying themselves as familiars for witches, to give healing advice, saying that they've been directed by fairy queens to come to witches. I mean, there's dozens of these things. It's remarkable, absolutely remarkable. Yeah.
I'll tell you, stepping up in intensity a little then from that, I'll tell you the first experience I had when I first started getting back into esotericism. This is about 25 years ago, I think. I was studying Crowley's book, The Magic in Theory and Practice. I was working up on the Black Sea in an ancient, what had been Heracleopontus, a very ancient Greek settlement on the Black Sea. One day I went through the town, scrambled up this like small hill in the town, wonderful view across the bay, and I noticed in the undergrowth there was these broken down like tombs. It was a very strange place. But that night I had the most bizarre dream. I dreamt I was attacked by this ugly skeletal like figure, and it was so real. I woke up immediately, sat up in bed, fully aware, and a voice boomed in my ear: if you don't go back and face this, the doors will be closed to you forever. And I put my head back on the pillow and immediately went to sleep, which is unusual for me, I tell you. Yeah. Immediately found myself back in exactly the space, and I could see that figure in the distance. So I started accelerating. I felt this huge energy, and I hit it square on, and it kind of dissolved into bits.
Right.
And this was a kind of very strange, I mean, the sense of it being a totally vivid experience within dream space accompanied this. So I mention it because often the encounter with other entities happens when you're sleeping, if you can wake up in the dream.
Yeah.
Okay, you can become aware of the being in a dream space,
Yeah.
And that does happen to me if I have any intrusive entity coming in.
Yeah.
I immediately become aware that I'm dreaming and that entity is there. I become consciously aware while still asleep, and I can deal with it. Okay. And I've seen some very strange, things passing through my space, I can tell you.
Yeah, I believe you.
I'll tell you one maybe of interest to people is one of the traditions here is that sorcery, which is sent, it's an energetic force that is sent against someone to attach itself to their aura. And in fact, there's an example of that in the book. I don't know if you recall, we actually managed to free it, and then it attached itself to our dog,
Right.
And he was like paralyzed for a week. We managed to bring him back.
Yeah, poor little thing.
So that the actual energetic knot that was had been sent to this person had a substantive, independent life of its own.
Right.
That was interesting. So I woke up once in the dream space and I saw this figure, and I would describe it as a black dog, except there were too many legs and too many heads, and they were all moving. And I immediately understood that it was another dimensional being of some kind. Okay. And it's interesting that when people talk about the hounds of Hecate, and Hecate had a bigger sanctuary just south of here, down in Laguna. I've been there many times. They manifest in this form. So it's generally associated with sorcery. I thought that might be interesting to people.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and like the black dog, as it were, is a theme again that comes up again and again, as a jinn manifestation, and a fairy manifestation as well. It's interesting. The many legs and the many head things is interesting too.
Yeah, it's like a futurist painting, they're trying to show movement, so they show the leg and the heads many times, but it was actually like that, but vibrating. So I understood this is other dimensional. We, our connection to other dimensional entities cannot be translated into the 3 dimensions plus time that we structure reality by. They seem to have some extra dimensions that we can't quite capture. So those other dimensions show up in our space as distortions. It seems to be. But maybe this is getting too weird for your audience.
No, not at all. No, they are. They're a bunch of fantastic weirdos who will, no doubt, absolutely love it.
I'm not trying to give anyone nightmares. I'm just saying.
But no, this is really hitting home for me, because that's essentially most of my late teens. That's what I had. I experienced that again and again and again.
In the dream space.
In the dream space, quite distinctly. And, would wake up with a very real sense of something's here, and fear and all that kind of stuff. And incidentally, I'll tell you a tale after we stop recording. It's not a one for general release at this point.
Okay.
But
let me interject then with another.
Go for it.
This another step forward. This sense of waking up and thinking they exist is a defining feature, I think, of another category of experiences, which is alien abduction. So although you have that sense they exist, the actual background to it is totally absent. And I was with Richard Boylan. This was, again, 15 years ago. And he's a very noted regression therapist specializing in UFO abduction.
Right.
And so, a friend of mine had this sense of having woken up. They exist. And curiously, a sense of mission, of spiritual purpose right now. So anyway, how do we get into this issue of ethics? As I say, the thing that struck me working with the constellations and the one-on-ones is that most of the traumatic events involved an ethical violation of the individual's sovereignty in some way. This is understandable in cases of abuse and so on. So that pointed me to the fact that unless it's just a random accident, then you're mostly looking at ethical issues in terms of what the field is carrying forward. and through the generational lines, the ancestral line, and into the family history, so that whereas the physical traumas are easily dealt with, ethical traumas require another order of resolution. And from constellation work, we know that the resolution can only be the acknowledgement of wrong, and the asking for forgiveness, and the granting of forgiveness.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and this is like a world apart from this drop down and hit me on the head trauma.
Yeah,
this is a very sensitive subject, to acknowledge that you have inflicted this, to acknowledge that you've been made a victim and disempowered thereby, and then to find within yourself forgiveness.
Yeah, it's big stuff.
It's big stuff. But this is what the healing of the field requires. So that is the essence of the work that goes on in constellation therapy. So whereas the setup is dead easy, and the interrogation of the individuals is dead easy, at the point you find the crux, you need to bring the person who's seeking therapy into that circle of energy. And they have to stand there and conduct this conversation. They have to say what the blame is that they have. They have to listen to acknowledgement of responsibility, and they have to find it in their heart to forgive that, to move on, not to condone it, by the way.
Yeah,
Nobody's
absolutely
condoning it.
Yeah.
We're just saying that in order to live our lives, we have to move on from it. And that's where the recoding of the field takes place. Okay, so that was kind of important. That is the highlight of the constellation system, and yet it's in sense in microcosm. It's what we need for healing on a far broader scale, isn't it? The traumas of all the past atrocities exist within the field in some form. So the process of ceasing to be angry about them and only being angry about them needs to be transcended by a process of seeing that they've become anchors, they become dead weights, so that only through the act of forgiveness, which comes from a place of understanding and love, can we harmonize the field again. So this caused me to think about, what do we mean when we talk about spiritual evolution? And it's not having a Kundalini experience, contrary to popular belief. It doesn't do it. You have a Kundalini experience, you have an enlightenment experience, and then it goes. That's it, unless you're capable of stabilizing it and then still behaving humanely. Okay, you're a bit like a saint, I suppose, in that respect. Fine. But for the rest of us mortals, spiritual evolution has got to be the reharmonization of the field ethically.
Right.
And it's only that allows us to then begin to adopt higher order ethics in our behavior day to day. Okay. So this is what I wanted to place at the end of the book. Healing rectifies the field, and it facilitates the emergence of a higher order of ethical behavior.
Yeah.
And when that happens, that's spiritual evolution. And that's why these small individual acts of healing are so important, and why it's so important each and every one of us engage in it. Instead of acting out our anger, pain, anxiety, frustration, and etc., blaming day to day, we start converting that base-led energy into the gold of love and acceptance. And I think that's for me what I wanted to get across with the book.
Oh. Well,
promo.
There it is. Do a double promo. Do a double promo there. Well, I think you did it. I think you did it wonderfully, Peter. And as I said, the book is really, really well structured, fantastically put together, and as I said, potent in places where, you know, I've had to really sit down and digest it and ask questions of myself, you know, which I suppose is the desired effect. You know,
challenge me to write it. Yeah. I tell you. I'm like, oh,
yeah. And you know, one of the things I loved about it, again in the area of values and the point you make around, you know, work with what's in your sphere of influence. You know, what can I decide to react to or not? What can I decide to engage with or not? You know, where should I spend my time? Like, that's enough. You know, just because if enough people do that, there's a big change. And that's where kind of
whenever one person heals, all of the relationships around them heal and change.
Yeah.
You know, so it's like a stone dropped in a pond. You know, it ripples. If enough of us do that, then significant change happens in society.
Yeah. And to your earlier kind of point about you know, animal sentience and personhood, I feel very much the same way about my environment, you know, and I think it's that individual responsibility and stewardship towards nature, and whether that's you know, a house plant, you know, that you tend, or whether it's a vast area of land, it's the same principles. It's like work with and heal with what you have under, you know, under your responsibility, you know.
Yes, absolutely.
And start there. And Peter, thank you so much for your time. The book's pleasure, and it's an absolute pleasure to talk with you again.
Pleasure is mine.
You know, and for those who want to get the book that I'm shamelessly promoting again, Ru,
please do.
Where is the best place for them to get themselves a copy?
Amazon.com at the moment, and the UK launch is now set for the 3rd of March because they have a huge problem with the supply chain getting books into the UK. So it was originally going to be February, but now it's 3rd of March. But it's available on Kindle immediately.
Right.
And that's it really, from Inner Traditions as well as Amazon. So
fantastic.
Easily found. And they can find me at petermarkadams.com. And they can find Mind Connection Healing, which is featured in the book, at mindconnectionhealing.com. If they want to explore that modality, we've got webinars coming up. So
brilliant.
It's all grist to the middle, the healing mill.
Wonderful, Peter. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
I look forward to the next one.
What an absolute pleasure that was. I really enjoyed that. It's always a pleasure to talk to Peter. He's such a gentleman and extremely wise. There were a couple of times in that conversation when really he left me bereft of words with what he was saying, which, as you know, as a podcaster, talking is one of my special powers. So I do hope you consider the book if you're anyway interested in healing, either yourself or others. I think it's a really valuable book. And as I said, the passage at the end of it around ethics, I found extremely moving and deeply resonant. made me want to be the best version of me. And I think that's an important thing, isn't it? When books make you feel like that, you want to change things, which is good, really good stuff. Right, I'm going to leave it there. I hope you enjoyed the show. I'm Dara Mason. You've been listening to The Spirit Box. Take care and talk soon. Bye.